Hello, I'm Bill McNally. Welcome to America's Future. My guest today is Samuel L. Blumenfeld. He is an author. He has appeared on this show before with his Alpha Phonics program. He's appeared in many publications, lectured and held seminars in 50 states and Canada, England, Australia, New Zealand. He's taught both in the public and private schools. And the subject of today's presentation is Who Wrote Shakespeare? Welcome, Mr. Blumenfeld. Thanks for coming back to Windham, New Hampshire.
Pleasure to be with you, Bill.
You know, earlier we did this show here, the Alpha Phonics. I hope we'll run that sometime for the viewers and they can get a look at that.
Yes.
So, what is your new book here, the Marlowe-Shakespeare Connection, all about?
Well, it's really about the Shakespeare authorship question. And while there has been a great deal of debate over who wrote Shakespeare, I believe that I have solved the problem with my book. In other words, I believe that Christopher Marlowe was the actual author of the works attributed to Shakespeare. And I've gone through all of the Marlowe plays and poems and all of Shakespeare's works, and you see a direct line between the two bodies of works. You see there's not much difference between them.
When is this book going to be published?
It should be published in the late summer of 2008.
Okay. Now, a lot of people are going to ask, does it really matter who wrote the plays?
Well, the truth always matters, you see, and that's the problem that we've had in all of these centuries. You know, this problem is over 300 years old. And it first started when a clergyman by the name of Reverend Wilmot, in the late 18th century, in the 1700s, became a great admirer of Shakespeare, and he wanted to write a biography about the man. So he went to Stratford and lived there for a time and traveled around the area seeking anything that belonged to Shakespeare, books, letters, anything that would enlighten or illuminate the man's career as a writer. And he came up with nothing at all. And so he came to the conclusion that Shakespeare was not a writer. I mean, he might have been a lot of other things, but he certainly was not a writer. And he left Stratford very depressed. And in fact, he ordered that all of his notes be burned after his death. So we don't even know who he suspected might have been the writer, but he knew that Shakespeare wasn't. And of course that question has persisted over the centuries because Shakespeare's biography simply does not match what we find in the works, in the sonnets or in the plays. And so the question has always been, well, if Shakespeare didn't write them, who did, you see? And of course, I've been doing a lot of research in this, and I became a Marlovian, that is a believer in the Marlowe theory, when I was an editor back in New York in the 1950s, and Calvin Hoffman came to my office, that is at Grosset and Dunlap, and he wanted us to reprint his book in paperback. His book was The Murder of the Man Who Was Shakespeare, and in that book, he posited the idea that Christopher Marlowe was actually the writer of the plays and poems. And of course the question has always been, well, wasn't Marlowe murdered at the age of 29 in 1593 before he could write all of these plays? And what we've discovered, and what I certainly have I'm sure of, is that Marlowe was not killed, that was a faked death to get him out of trouble, because he was in a great deal of trouble with the Archbishop's inquisition against Catholics, Puritans, atheists, anyone who seriously doubted the prominence or the dominance of the Anglican Church, of Queen Elizabeth's church. So he was threatened with being executed. And his protectors, you see, he was also a member of the Secret Service. He had been recruited when he was at Cambridge University. He had been recruited as a spy. And so his protectors, who were very much concerned about his being tortured and revealing what was going on behind the scenes, they decided to stage this fake death so that Marlowe would be free of any indictment, and of course he would have to change his identity. He would be given a new identity by his mentors, and he would have to go into exile for a while, which is what he did. And we believe that he went to Italy, you see. So it's a rather involved story, but it's a fantastic one. And it could have only taken place in Elizabethan times, where all sorts of crazy things were happening,
Well, earlier we were looking at YouTube, and there seems to be a lot of interest in this authorship. So tell us about how much interest there is in this.
Well, there's always been a great deal of interest. As a matter of fact, recently, in England, there was formed the Shakespeare Authorship Coalition, and I have that on the back of my brochure. And the purpose of this new coalition, it's dedicated to legitimizing the Shakespeare authorship issue by increasing awareness of reasonable doubt about the identity of William Shakespeare. So in England alone, and of course this organization, you have access to it all over the world, and they on the internet they've placed a declaration of you might say declaration of reasonable doubt about Shakespeare, and you can sign this declaration, and over 1,000 people have already signed this declaration, and they include actors and producers and people of substance, judges, academics, because this whole question of Shakespeare's authorship has been around for a long time. But of course, the question has always been, if he didn't write the works, who did, you see? Right. And of course, there have been many different contenders.
How important is Shakespeare?
Well, Shakespeare is very important. First of all, the first folio, which has the 36 plays that was published in 1623, that is second only to the King James Version of the Bible in its importance to our culture and our language, you see. So it's vitally important to know who wrote these plays and poems.
So why have people questioned the Shakespeare's authorship?
Well, they've questioned it because you have this discrepancy between his life and the works. Let me, for example, give you a quote from Diana Price's book. Now, Diana Price wrote what she calls Shakespeare's Unorthodox Biography, which was published in 2001. And in that book, she examined all of the documents pertaining to Shakespeare that have been unearthed by literary scholars during the last 300 years. And this was her conclusion. She concluded that Shakespeare was not a writer. She wrote, quote, "These documents account for the activities of an actor, a theater shareholder, a businessman, a moneylender, a property holder, a litigant, and a man with a family, but they do not account for his presumed life as a professional writer." you see.
You mentioned Diana Price. Now, what about Reverend Wilmot?
Well, Reverend Wilmot was in the 1700s, you see, and he didn't offer how would you say, an alternative writer. All he did was come to the conclusion that Shakespeare couldn't have written these plays because he found nothing about Shakespeare as a writer while he was there in Stratford interviewing people and searching for anything that belonged to Shakespeare that would indicate that he even owned a book.
What kind of education did Shakespeare have?
From what we know, he had none. There is no documentation concerning Shakespeare's education. Even though there was a grammar school in Stratford, there's no documentation that he attended that school. And yet, the plays had to be written by somebody with an extensive classical education. And that man, of course, was Christopher Marlowe, who was very well educated. He attended the King's School, the King Grammar School in Canterbury, and then he spent 6 years at Cambridge University and came out with a master's degree. So the man was extremely well educated and had all of the background that would be necessary for him to write these plays.
Well, if we say, he had no education, well, if Shakespeare was not a writer, then what was he?
Well, as I said, he was a money lender, a property holder, a theater shareholder, an actor, a man with a family, etc., but not a writer, you see. There's no documentation of him being a writer. The only claim to fame he has is that his name appears on the first folio. And why does it appear? Because the people who put it together could not put Marlowe's name on it. Marlowe was supposed to be dead, you see. So they couldn't put his name on it. And if they did, they would all hang because they would be part of the conspiracy, you see.
Right.
So Marlowe had every reason to hide his identity. And so the people who, and incidentally, when the first folio was published in 1623, Shakespeare had already been dead for a number of years. He died in 1616. So, he had no say over the matter. In other words, he had no say over whether or not his name would be on the first folio. And incidentally, neither did his family. The family, had he actually been the writer of these plays, would have benefited from the first folio because they could have made some money. But nothing happened because they knew that he was not a writer. His relatives, his daughter, his son-in-law knew that he was not a writer.
All right, are there more than one contender for this authorship?
Oh, yes. As I mentioned, you have the Sir Francis Bacon was one, and the problem with Sir Francis Bacon is that he was a great philosopher and a great essayist, but he had no reason to hide the fact that he wrote the greatest plays in English literary history. There's no reason for him to have hidden that since he was already known as a writer. So we can discount Bacon. The next contender is Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, and he has a lot of fans. But the problem with Edward de Vere is that he was not a literary genius. He was at best a mediocre poet. He was at best a mediocre poet. And he also died too soon. He died before many of the important plays were written. The only man who had both the literary genius and was a professional writer who could write 36 plays, plus the ones that he had written under the name of Marlowe, was Christopher Marlowe. And you don't have two great literary geniuses popping up at the same time. There was only one, and it was Christopher Marlowe. And to my mind, the proof that he wrote them is the fact that these plays exist. The 36 plays exist. And incidentally, the publisher of the first folio was Marlowe's executor, you see. So there's the connection. The man who published the first folio knew Marlowe when he was known as Marlowe, knew his benefactor, and was there at the very end, and was probably the man who transmitted Marlowe's plays to Shakespeare's company. There had to be a go-between, and Ed Blount was it.
Now, I know that the Supreme Court was doing like a mock trial, right? We saw that on YouTube?
Yes.
A little thing like that. Has there been any plays or movies written on this yet?
Yeah, a Australian cinematographer did a very, very good video on the Marlowe theory, and it's called Much Ado About Something, and it was shown on PBS. But the point is that the reason why I wrote my book is because I wanted to write a book that would leave virtually no doubt as to who the true writer was, because an awful lot of people simply believe that Marlowe was killed. I mean, for example, you've had some recent biographies of Marlowe that were written, and all of them accept the idea that he was killed. None of them question the coroner's inquest. None of them have seriously questioned the idea that he was not killed. But I do that in my book very thoroughly.
How many books have been written attempting to solve this mystery?
Well, many of the Earl of Oxford fans have written books on this subject, and the problem with their books is that they are very fat but very boring, because they can't be conclusive. You see, there's so little to go on with the Earl of Oxford. All of their points are, you might say, coincidental. You know, the fact that he was Lord Burleigh's son-in-law, and so was close to the Queen, close to the court, had traveled to Italy, knew Italy and all of that. Also, he knew about the life of the aristocracy, so they just assumed this fellow back in the early 20s, a fellow by the name of Loney. His name is spelled L-O-O-N-E-Y, which would be Looney, but it's pronounced Loney. He wrote the first book claiming that it was the Earl of Oxford who wrote the works of Shakespeare. And of course, he believed the notion that Marlowe was killed in 1593. So in other words, if you believe that Marlowe was actually killed in 1593, well, you have to discount him. But if you believe that that was a fake murder to get him off the hook, and that he then went into exile and wrote plays in exile, and because he was in the Secret Service, he could have those plays transported back in a diplomatic pouch, you see, to Lord Burleigh or to his benefactor, Sir Thomas Walsingham, and that his executor, Edward Blount, could then get them produced by Shakespeare's theater, you see.
So Marlowe's alleged death is attributing to less people believing in Marlowe?
Yeah, well, that's it, you see, so they discount him. But I've done a very thorough study of the whole situation. I've gone through the coroner's inquest very carefully. And for example, the coroner's inquest says that the brawl or the fight that broke out between Marlowe and this other fellow, Ingram, at this tavern had something to do with the bill. You know, who was going to pay the bill?
Right.
But that's so ridiculous, because all of the people there were Walsingham's own men, and all of them were on his payroll. And so they were there on spy business,
Right.
if anything.
So they would have protected him, wouldn't
Well, not only that, but they would not have had to pay the bill. The bill would have been
Oh, yeah.
paid by their their boss, you see. So the idea that this was a brawl over a bill is so ridiculous, you know. They call it the reckoning. A whole book was written on that premise that it was the reckoning, the bill, that was responsible for Marlowe's death. It was a put-up job if there ever was one. All you have to do is read the coroner's inquest, and you could see how phony the whole thing is. But the coroner's inquest was written in Latin, you see, so very few people had access to it. And what it did was it closed the case against Marlowe. That was its most important function, was to close the case against Marlowe. And that freed him to go into exile, which he did, you know, because he could easily do that. They gave him a new passport, new identity, and all of that. And so he went to probably to Italy and wrote some of the plays which are staged in Italy. You know, the scenes are in Italy, and Italians have said, there's an Italian professor at the University of Venice who says, you have to have been in Venice to be able to have written about it. And Shakespeare never went to Italy. Shakespeare never left England, you see. But we know that Marlowe was there. And so that's all we have to know. I mean, there's more than enough evidence that not only that Marlowe wrote the plays, but he also inserted in each play a clue to give you the insight that he wrote it. For example, in Hamlet, probably the most famous play ever written. Wouldn't you say Hamlet is the most famous play ever written? Well, there's a very big scene in which Hamlet has invited this troupe of actors to act out this plot to catch his uncle, you know, make his uncle feel guilty, to act out his father's murder. So these actors come, and Hamlet wants to see a sample of their work. So he asks them about this play about Dido and Aeneas. Well, that's the play that Marlowe had written about Dido. And he says, can you recite that particular speech in which Aeneas tells Dido how horrible it was in Troy when the Greeks overthrew it? And it's virtually a repeat of what is in Marlowe's play. And it goes on for lines and lines, you see. That's the kind of thing that Marlowe did. He put Dido in many plays to make sure that you knew who actually wrote them, you see. Then there's another interesting thing. Marlowe's father was a cobbler, you know, a shoemaker, or a shoe repairer.
Right.
And Marlowe pays tribute to his father in two plays, in Julius Caesar and in Henry V. In Julius Caesar, the play opens with a scene where you've got all this mob of people who have come to welcome Julius Caesar back. And the police are very concerned, and they want to scatter the mob, so they ask these people, you know, what do you do? Why are you here? And they accost this one gentleman, and they say, well, what do you do? And he says, I'm a cobbler. And he says, well, what do you do? What do cobblers do? He says, I repair souls, you see. And then he goes on to express his own philosophy of life, you see. So why would Shakespeare have inserted a cobbler in the opening scene of Julius Caesar when his father was a glove maker, you know, not a cobbler? But Marlowe's father was a cobbler. And then in Henry V, Henry celebrates the great victory at Agincourt, you know. And he says, on St. Crispin's Day, we achieved this great victory. Now, who is St. Crispin? St. Crispin is the patron saint of cobblers, you see. Why would Henry V, you know, cite the patron saint of cobblers at that incredible moment in that play. You see. Well, that's how Marlowe managed to insert his own little things, his own little clues in the plays. And if you go through all of them, there's all sorts of things. There's all sorts of scenes about exile.
Where did he go after his alleged exile, or after his fake death? Where did Marlowe go to?
Well, he went to Italy. We believe he went to the continent. We believe that he went to Italy and elsewhere. We believe also that he came back to England for a short while under an assumed name and posing as a Frenchman. He was fluent in French. And also we believe that he wrote the translation of Cervantes' Don Quixote. And the name of the so-called translator was Thomas Shelton. Now that's a very interesting name. Nobody knows anything about him. They don't know where he was born. He's like a phantom figure. Thomas is the name of his benefactor, Sir Thomas Walsingham. Shelton is the maiden name of Walsingham's wife, Audrey Shelton, you see. So that's where you get Thomas Shelton from, you see. Now, this particular translation of Don Quixote was written in the 1600s. And guess who was its publisher? Edward Blount, the same man who was Marlowe's executor and who later was the publisher of the first folio. So when you see all of these connections, you can't help but believe that this was a very smooth operating conspiracy in which everyone played their part very well, you see.
Sounds like it's going to be a good, you've made a good point for a good novel, or I mean a good movie.
Absolutely, I believe it can be a good movie.
So how about who helped Marlowe escape the hangman's noose, so to speak?
Well, he was helped by the top men in Elizabeth's government. He was helped by Lord Burleigh and his son, Robert Cecil. Now, the interesting thing about Lord Burleigh and Robert Cecil were the head not only of Elizabeth's government, but they were also head of the Secret Service. And Marlowe worked for them, because Marlowe had a very special relationship with Lord Burleigh. It was almost a kind of father-son relationship. And Burleigh was there when, you see, Marlowe had been sent on a spy mission when he was at Cambridge University. He was sent to the Catholic seminary in Reims in France, where young Englishmen were being trained to come back to England to reestablish the Catholic Church. And among them was one of them who would assassinate Queen Elizabeth. So Marlowe was sent there as a spy, and of course, in order to get into the seminary, he had to pretend that he was going to become a Catholic. He was a Protestant, like all of them at that time. And so he was very clever in being able to put over the idea that he wanted to convert to Catholicism. So when he got back to Cambridge and he wanted to get his master's degree, the authorities there refused to give it to him because they said, "You've gone over to the other side." See, the authorities at Cambridge were Protestants, they were Calvinists. So Marlowe had to get a letter from Lord Burleigh, from the Privy Council, saying that he was doing the Queen's work, that he was not disloyal, he did not go to the other side, but had performed useful services for the Queen. And in that way, all of a sudden his stature at the university was greatly enhanced, and of course he got his master's degree.
Well, Mr. Blumenfeld, I really appreciate this. There's so much more to cover and so little time, but you Can you come to the Windham Library and give a lecture on this?
I'd love to, you know, if they want
After your trip to England, maybe?
Yeah, yes, I'm going to
July,
England, yeah.
Somewhere in
Yeah.
that time frame?
Right, right.
Well, okay. I'd like to thank the studios here, the volunteers, and the opportunity to present this new book of yours, and I wish you the best of luck.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
for
you,
coming.
Bill.